Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Russell T. Warne. I am an associate professor of psychology at Utah Valley University, and I am here to give a brief webinar about the second edition of my stats textbook, Statistics for the Social Sciences, a General Linear Model Approach. I'm glad you joined me today. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the book and answer some of the questions that have come in advance before this webinar. But if you have any questions that pop up, you want to know anything about the book, just type them in the chat, and Jennifer from Cambridge will forward those to me, and I'd be happy to answer them for you. So I'd love to handle those as they come up. I conduct research in psychology as a faculty member here at Utah Valley University. Most of my research is in a branch of psych called differential psychology, which is about the individual differences about people. I'm mostly interested in cognitive abilities. And that's why I'm also the author of another Cambridge University Press book, In the Know, Debunking 35 Myths About Human Intelligence. And that one just came out in October. So if you want a double dose of Warne, there's two different books out there. But the rest of this webinar, I'm only talking about the second edition of Statistics for the Social Sciences. All right. I first want to tell you why I wrote the Statistics for the Social Sciences, and it's very much tied into my position here at Utah Valley University. I love UVU. It's a wonderful school, but it's a little unique. We're the largest institution in my state in Utah, and we're an open enrollment school. So there are no minimum GPA requirements. There's no minimum SAT for students to enroll. And as a result, I get a really wide range of students here at UVU. I get students who could have gone to any of the major universities in the West. They could have gone to Stanford, they could have gone to Arizona State, University of Utah, and others. And then I have students who, to be a little diplomatic about it, didn't have any other options besides an open enrollment school. And students at those extremes are sitting next to each other in my class. And I was finding that a lot of the traditional textbooks for stats would work for one group of students or another. And I needed a book that worked for a wide range of preparation levels, of comfort with math, etc. And after a while, I said, well, I can't find one, so I'm going to write one myself. And I had a couple of goals in there. One is that I wanted to reduce the math and statistics and anxiety because I teach social science students. They come from psychology, sociology, anthropology, family science. I get social work students, plus a couple other fields. I get communication students in my class, exercise science. And most of these students have quite a bit of math or statistics anxiety. You put a formula on the screen in the front of the room, and you can almost see the tightness in their chest come as they see Greek letters and square root symbols. And a lot of my students also don't consider themselves math people. And I've heard several of my students every semester say, I'm not a math person. I'm so scared of this class. And I wanted a book that would serve a variety of student preparation levels and that would also make statistics accessible, reduce the anxiety, and really be an on-ramp to students' success in working in their majors and thinking like a scientist. And so that was my goal in writing this book. Because it's designed for a wide range of students, the book only requires a knowledge of basic algebra. I write the book under the assumption that students already know how to find a proportion, they already know how to calculate a percentage, they already know the basic math operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and that they can solve equations to find the value of a variable. So basic high school math is all a student needs to succeed in this, but if they have more, so much the better. Another one of my goals was to show the connection between statistics and my students' fields. one of my favorite things to do my first day every semester is to ask my students, if you didn't have to, would you take this course? I ask them to raise their hands. And if I'm lucky, in a class of about 120 to 170, I'll get 3 students raising their hands saying, yeah, I would take this course. Most of my students don't want to be in stats, and that's okay. But I understand that coming into it. So a big message of the book is to show how statistics is relevant to all these different fields in the social sciences, and to show how statistics is part of creating knowledge, creating interventions, and helping us understand what's correct and what's not in the social sciences. And so a lot of it is just again and again showing the relevance through real life examples, through explaining how we know that intervention A is more effective than intervention B, etc. And then my final goal was to implement the general linear model into teaching statistics to undergraduates. The general linear model is this family of statistical procedures. They all have 3 things in common. One is that all these procedures investigate the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. Another is that all of these procedures apply statistical weights to data. And then finally, they all produce an effect size. And this is something that if you say it to a quantitative psychologist, if you say it to a statistician, hey, did you know that almost every statistical procedure is a general member of the general linear model? They'll yawn, oh yeah, oh, we've known that for 50 years, big deal. But this is completely absent outside of graduate level training, outside of the professional communication. I can't find it anywhere in the undergraduate training. And to me, this is the best way to teach statistics to undergraduates because it provides students a mental framework, a cognitive schema is what we call it in educational psych and cognitive psychology. It provides this framework that students can use to assimilate knowledge and to assimilate what they're learning. The absolute worst thing you can do when teaching stats to students is to pretend that all of the methods are completely separate and that they have nothing in common. That's just begging for students to be confused and to not understand the different procedures. What I do instead with the general linear models, I say, look, all these procedures have these characteristics in common. And any given 2 or 3 procedures you want have even more in common than that. And so I teach that at the beginning of the inferential statistics piece. And then I say, hey, look, you've learned the simplest inferential statistics method. The next method is the same thing because they're both members of the general linear model. We just have to tweak the procedures in a few ways. And that's how each chapter goes. Each chapter says, hey, this new procedure, there's very little new about it whatsoever. It's just the last procedure, but we had to change it a little bit because the data are a little bit different. And at first, it's a little slow going, but by the end of a semester, my students pick up new procedures incredibly fast. The last one I usually teach are chi-squared procedures. And by the end of a semester, my students can learn a 2-variable chi-squared test in about 30 or 35 minutes because they know what's coming. They know what the steps are. They just want to know how the data get changed a little bit. And so I find that a huge benefit of teaching a general linear model is it gives students that framework of understanding things. They can assimilate new knowledge. They understand how ideas relate. And it's faster. It's more efficient. I can whip through a lot more stuff without sacrificing student competence, student mastery. And it ends up being a very successful procedure, successful strategy. So the target audience is undergraduates, but it's also a useful book for master students who only need 1 semester of stats. The book is designed under the assumption that it is going to be a 1 semester standalone stats class. And that works just fine for the vast majority of undergraduates and for many master's programs in the social sciences, especially ones that don't require a thesis or don't require independent research. To explain how the book is structured, the best thing to do is to look at the table of contents, and I'll ask Jennifer to show the table of contents there on the screen for you. There are 15 chapters in the book. The first third of them, chapters 1 through 5, are the basic background of statistics, the basic theoretical understanding, and descriptive statistics. So there's an introductory chapter, chapter 1, stating, why do you need statistics? Here's what models are in general. Then we move on to types of data in chapter 2, central tendency and variability in chapter 3, things like histograms and other pictures to visualize data in chapter 4, and then linear transformations and z-scores. And all of those are all about describing data, just understanding the basics of stats, and that takes about a third of a semester, I find. And then chapter 6 is a transition chapter that provides the theoretical foundation for inferential stats. And then chapter 7 through 14, that's where the heavy-duty stats procedures are. And the listing of those chapters is very typical for one semester stats books. But in each of those one by one, I go through and I say, okay, this is a member of the general linear model. Here are the 8 steps to conducting a null hypothesis test. Here's the effect size you get, etc. And then with each new chapter, there's a brief reminder of what the last chapter was used for, what that procedure is used for, and then saying, all right, time to turn it loose and show you how to do this new procedure, which isn't new at all. It's just the same one as before with a couple of changes. And then finally, chapter 15, it's a little different. It's a guide to applying statistics, to using statistics for students who might one day have to use their own, analyze their own data for their own research projects. And then it also is a guide for conducting and understanding some of the more advanced statistical procedures that we often see in the social sciences, especially multiple regression, two-way and three-way ANOVA, logistic regression and multiple logistic regression, and then some basic non-parametric procedures, Spearman's row, Wilcoxon rank sum, and Kruskal-Wallis tests. It's important to know what's not in the book, because it's not comprehensive. It would be very difficult to create a one semester text that covers every single statistical procedure out there. Time series data is not in this. I do have a free data set that people can download that has great time series data though, but email me if you're interested in that. It doesn't have advanced multivariate procedures like MANOVA, factor analysis, structural equation modeling. There aren't any psychometric analyses in this. There's nothing about how to find reliability, nothing about examining data for test bias. The more advanced non-parametric statistics beyond Spearman's row or Wilcoxon or Kruskal-Wallis tests, those aren't in there. And there's nothing about clustered data analysis. And so those are all, in my experience, topics that students get to in their third, fourth semester of stats. I designed my book so it would be a good foundation for anyone who goes on to learn those things. They'll understand that, MANOVA is a general linear model procedure, but I don't dive into it with data and show students how to analyze those at all. This is the second edition of the book. There have been some changes and improvements from the first edition. It's the second edition up here at the top. And if you look in page 12 of the front matter, which I'll have Jennifer go to, there's a brief listing. So if you've used the first edition, there's a brief listing of the improvements to this version. I do like the first version. I had a lot of success in it for 3 years, but there were things that I heard from readers that they wanted expanded discussions. Um, and so one change is that I made the notation more consistent across chapters, which helps students not be so confused. Um, I also improved the discussion of effect sizes for chapter 14 chi-squared. Since the first since the first edition came out, the American Psychological Association updated their journal article reporting standards. It's the standards for reporting statistical information and methodological information in studies. I've updated the book to conform to those requirements so that students can already have practice reporting what they should report in their analyses. I've improved the data for the ANOVA and restriction of range examples, so they're a little more clear cut. And then I expanded the discussion about type 1 error inflation in the final chapter and about multiple regression and interactions. And then there's a variety of minor changes that most people won't notice, but those are the big changes. And I'm really happy about how this book it has improved. It only keeps getting better. And so I think that those changes are going to improve the quality of the teaching for people who use the book. I now want to show you some of the features in the book. When possible, I used real data from my students' majors and from related fields so that students can see the link between data and understanding in the social sciences. And so right there you can see the chapters are the examples are listed in the order that they first appear. I use some of them across chapters. So I mean, there's everything from, the first one my students just love. It's a study about baby naming practices. Everyone likes that one. If you keep going down, there's other examples. For example, the counterintuitive finding that in the UK, almost 2/3 of households have an income below average. And so there's this convenient table that says, hey, look, here's all the real life examples, and here's what fields they relate to. And then if something jumps out at you, you want to try to find an example, this table shows you where you can find an example that you may have read earlier or that you might want to reuse in a different chapter. I also have this feature that I call sidebars. There's an example of this on page 38 that I really like. If you can jump there. Sidebars are where I put extra information that might not be entirely essential to mastering a statistical procedure, but it dives into a discussion or dives into a controversy or just provides some useful information. So you see these as text boxes in a lot of books. In this book, they're called sidebars. And I like this one. Outliers aren't bad people. What do you do with your data if you do have an outlier who might be distorting some of it? And so I show students, sometimes an outlier might be a sign that you have a typo. Sometimes it's someone who shouldn't be in the study. But if they're distorting your results, they're not trying to. We're all outliers in something. And so that's a nice little discussion of outliers. My students like them. They're a really great way, these sidebars, to stimulate a conversation about the practice of statistics, or to talk about conversations and things like that. Every chapter also has worked out examples. And so if you'll jump to page 105, this is from chapter 5, which is about linear transformations. And there's actually a couple of worked out examples that start on chapter 105. But this actually shows the arithmetic of how do we get our results. I know that in the 21st century, everyone does their stats on computer. That I'm not showing these examples and these worked out, this worked out arithmetic under the expectation that this is how students are going to do stats when they finish the class. But I feel like students need to be aware of what's happening with the formulas or what's happening in the computer programs so that they can understand the statistics better, they can interpret them better, and in case there's a mistake, they can get an idea of what realistic answers should look like or not. And so as I talk about these concepts, every chapter has worked out examples embedded in the text. And then to help students and give them more practice, if you'll jump to page 113, all the chapters have at least one of these guided practices. So here's an example of the same thing. It's just more arithmetic to show, hey, you already saw one example, here's another. And that's to help students if they have homework assignments so that they can have multiple reference points to see how a procedure is done or to understand the steps that a computer program might be doing. And so every chapter that talks about arithmetic has at least one of these guided practices. So every chapter gives students at least 2 examples, an in-text one and a guided practice. Jumping ahead, and we're still in that same chapter 5 with linear transformations to page 116. I have embedded several times in every chapter these little boxes. If you'll scroll down a little bit, they have a heading that says check yourself. And these are 3 or 4 questions to help students with comprehension. All of the answers can be found within the previous couple of pages of text. And it's just to help students to stay on track, to see, hey, these are the important ideas. And I find them really useful for generating quiz and test questions for students. And so it's a great way to help make sure students understand what they're reading. At the end of every chapter, I have 4 features that you'll always find. The first one, you can see the top, the beginning of it there, is just a summary. Quick recap of what the chapter covers, usually in the course of about 2 to 4 paragraphs. And if you'll scroll down after that summary, there are practice or homework questions, and they're always divided into 2 groups. One is comprehension. Those are a lot like that check yourself question, although they tend to be broader about the whole chapter, not just one specific section. And then the application is actual data analysis, actual application of what they've learned. And these are great resources for homework assignments. They're the bread and butter of the homeworks in my class. And students like a low stakes situation where they have questions that they can figure out by rereading sections of the chapter or by trying to work out a problem by themselves, and then checking that they're doing it right with the guided practice or the in-text example. If you continue to scroll down, you'll see starting on page 119 is this chapter software guide. At the end of every chapter, this software guide is there to give students step-by-step instructions on how to run these statistics in Excel and in SPSS. And there's screenshots with every step so students can see, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. Here's what it's supposed to look like. And I picked those 2 programs. I know that R is gaining in popularity, so SAS and Stata and JAMP and others. I picked Excel because, at least in the United States, the vast majority of social science students never go on to graduate school, so they're not going to have access to expensive statistical software often, but almost everyone has access to Excel or a similar program. And then I picked SPSS because its point and click interface is very useful for students who are just barely getting familiar with using computers to conduct stats. And then finally, at the end of every chapter, you'll see this on page 127 of this chapter, is just a little further reading. It's just a 1 to 3 um, selection, one to three articles that are related to the topic that are accessible enough for undergraduates to read. And that's sometimes hard in stats. In this chapter, there's only one article, but in all the others, there's two or three, and it's just recommendations um, for professors or instructors who want more detail and who want to dive into an idea more, or for curious students, or for optional readings where you can talk more about theory and application of stats. So those are the features we see in every chapter. I want to jump ahead to page 172. This is an example of an in-text discussion of the general linear model. If you will scroll down a little bit, Jennifer. Um, and every chapter in inferential statistics, scroll down a little bit more. It's towards the bottom of the page. Yeah, it has this heading, general linear model, and then beneath that is the text explaining, okay, remember, here are those three characteristics of the general linear model. They all look for relationships between independent and dependent variables. They all use weights. They all find an effect size. And then it says, here is where those are in this chapter's procedure. And that's just to strengthen the understanding of the general linear model, to show students that every member of the general linear model has these characteristics. And oh yeah, those equations, that logic, etc., that still applies here to this new procedure you've learned. And then if you'll scroll down a little bit more to page 173, I also have additional text box. You can see the heading of it there at the bottom of the screen, called General Linear Moments. And it's just ways of talking more about the general linear model, telling students more about it, and exploring it a little bit more, so it's not some weird abstract concept, so it becomes the way that they think about statistics. At the end of the book, if you'll jump to page 499, I have a bunch of statistical tables. These are at the end of pretty much every statistics textbook. Because these are derived with formulas, they're the exact same numbers as you would find in any other table. They don't change, but they're very useful there for students looking up numbers if you decide to teach this by hand with hand calculation. On page 521, there's a glossary where every bolded term, every term that is used in the book in a technical way is compiled here, and so students can really quickly, if they forget what a definition means, they can look it up very quickly and get a quick reminder of what the definition of a term is. A new feature in the second edition, and my students right now using the book, they're my first semester using the new edition. On page 537, they really like this. It's a formula guide. Every formula that is used in calculation in some way is on this formula guide, and it's like a little cheat sheet. They're listed in the order that they're given in the book. And you have right there the chapter it's in, the formula number, the formula itself, and then what it's used for, and an explanation of the symbol. So if you can jump ahead to page 537 there, Jennifer, I'd appreciate that. My students like this because it's easy to get confused about your formulas. And so let's have a one-stop shop where students can identify what the formulas are and what all these things mean. So that's a feature that starts on page 537 and it goes to page 541. And there's a lot of formulas in a stats book. And then there's also a student version of the answer key that's on page 542. And this doesn't provide the answers to all the questions, but it does provide answers to select questions, and it allows students to check their work on the homework for select questions, and it helps them see whether they're on the right path. There's also an instructor answer key that's separate that you can obtain from Cambridge, but the student version contains answers to some questions, but not all. In addition to that instructor answer key, there's also PowerPoints for the book that instructors can use, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback about them. I'm updating those now, and I'm testing them out on my students. I also have a quick summer class that will start in May, and so I want to run them by 2 semesters worth of students before I give the updated version to Cambridge. But they'll receive those in June 2021. But for the time being, the first edition PowerPoints are pretty good, except for the notation changes. Um, and then I also um, have online a test bank. It's 500 questions. There's a mix of short answer and multiple choice questions. 500 questions that cover the entire breadth of the book, and that's also an online resource um, um, for for instructors. So that's the book materials and supplementary materials. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the other online resources I like to do that they're not officially part of the book, but they help with the teaching. I love data repositories. I love turning my students loose and say, okay, here's a website with some data. Download one of the files and analyze it yourself and tell me what you can learn about it. Especially if your class is based on using a computer to conduct the stats. This is a great homework exercise. It's a great final project students can do. Every government of industrialized countries has data sets that can be downloaded. There's more and more social science data sets coming online. I like the ICPSR repository through, I believe it's the University of Michigan, intercollegiate something data social science repository, ICPSR. If you just Google those letters, it comes up. Um, I also love if you just type in central limit theorem applet, it's the first result that comes up. It's a really fun applet that gives a population, takes a sample from it, and starts building a sampling distribution. And then you can, with a click of a mouse, add 5 samples, 100 samples, 1,000, 10,000, all at once. And I like showing that. I like showing the principles of the central limit theorem with that. Scholarly articles. It's never too early to get undergraduates reading articles, interpreting the stats. I try to find scholarly articles that have simple research designs, true experiments with just 2 groups, experimental and a control group, that report the means and the standard deviation, then create homework assignments or activities saying, okay, based on what's in the article, can you calculate the effect size? What was the null hypothesis? Did they reject it? What does this mean? And it stretches students a lot, but it makes them more savvy as consumers of science. And then also I'm starting to make my own videos. Um, I have one about the central limit theorem that um, shows how it functions, how it creates a normal distribution. And it's with a Galton board that I bought. And then I've also made a general linear model video that explains them using an analogy of the Russian matryoshka nested dolls, and says that each procedure is nested inside of a larger, more complex procedure. And students seem to like that. I made that video for the first edition. Um, Compared to other books, I'm not unbiased. I think Statistics for the Social Sciences is is the best book out there for undergrads. Um, I think where it stands apart from others is not the material it covers. You'll find those chapter titles in almost any book. I think the focus on the general linear model really is key. And I've told you about the advantages of that already. I think the real life data examples are a real strength. Um, these aren't made up. We analyze data in the book about real people. Some of them are related to issues that my students care a lot about. For example, there's some mental health data in there, but I also try to do ones that college students tend to find fascinating. There's one about how appropriate it is to engage in Facebook stalking. That was from a real article I found. Another was talking about the increase in height that a lot of countries have seen across the generations, and students just find these fascinating. I think it's really flexible. The in-text examples are helpful, and the guided practices are helpful um, if your class has to use hand calculation. If your university doesn't have access to software, or it's not realistic to expect your students to all have access to a computer, then it works. On the other hand, if your university says we want students to be able to do stats on computer because this is the 21st century, everyone's been doing them on computer for decades, then it's there too. The software guides are there, and you can use the book as a jumping off point to giving students those computer program skills, data analysis skills on a computer. So I like how flexible it is. And then my students tell me that the writing style is very accessible. One of them last semester, talking about the first edition, said, "This book doesn't sound like it was written by a professor." She says, "It sounds like my friend who knows about stats is talking to me and teaching this to me." And I took that as a huge compliment. Um, you have to use the technical terminology, but I'm really careful with jargon. I picked the least jargony definition term possible that I could when there were multiple terms for the same concept. There's a glossary. I explain variables. I explain notation very clearly. And it's not as overly formal or dry as a lot of statistics books out there. And so that is my description of statistics for the social sciences, a general linear model approach, second edition. And alrighty. Well, I'm getting word from Jennifer on the chat that we should just wrap up. And so I appreciate you listening in. I appreciate you attending. If you're watching this later recorded, thank you. And feel free to reach out to me. My email address is rwarne@uvu.edu. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about this. And I'm also on social media. My Twitter handle is @RussWarne, RussWarne. And my official Facebook page is facebook.com/Russ Warne PhD. And so you can follow me on either of those or contact me through those to ask any questions you may have. Thanks for listening. Bye.